Hi, Haunted Family. Welcome back to another episode. As you may have noticed, I took last week off. That was entirely unintentional, but this is real life and things happen. Our contest has ended. It ended on Halloween, and our contest winner was announced on our Instagram page, and our prize pack has already been mailed out. But if you are not our winner, don't despair. We will do another contest at some point in the future. You may want to subscribe to our podcast for up-to-the-minute details on when our next contest giveaway will be, because we usually announce things there first. If you like what you've been hearing, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. Now, on with the show. One of the most repeated ghost stories in Charleston is that of Mary Bloomfield, better known as Charleston's Lady in White. She was the wife of a merchant during the Victorian era, in the later part of the 1800s. Tradition has it that her husband had a business in Boston, and, boarding a ship, he set sail for Massachusetts. At some point during the voyage, he became seriously ill and died. Mary never found out what happened to her husband, for, as she waited for his return, she also became very sick and passed away. Her husband was buried in Boston, while Mary was buried in Charleston, in the Unitarian Cemetery. It is said that she walks the graveyard in the late afternoon and early evening, seeking the whereabouts of her poor, ill-fated husband. Here's where the story ends and reality takes over. My friend works for one of the many walking tour companies in Charleston and spends the majority of his afternoon and evenings leading tourists through some of the oldest streets in America, telling the legends and tales of the haunted South. One of the highlights of the tour is the old Unitarian graveyard. It's an old graveyard full of crumbling headstones and choked with weeds that dates back to the 1700s. My friend leads dozens of tourists to the cemetery daily, and has done so for months without incident. So, when he led 20 tourists through the maze of vines and granite in the twilight of a February afternoon, he expected to find the graveyard was, as he normally did, quiet and empty. He walked into the middle of the graveyard, and, as the tourists gathered around him, listening to his tale, he became abruptly aware of an eavesdropper. She walked slowly among the graves, making no noise, but was intently watching, with great curiosity, the small, huddled group. Perhaps she was listening to the guide's account of her sad demise, or maybe she was searching the faces of the small assemblage for one that she recognized as her lost love. But, for those who witnessed her, the woman with the upswept dark hair and white dress with a high collar, without a doubt, was Mary Bloomfield. But what gave her away was not the antiquated style of her hair or gown. It was the unnatural way her eyes followed the visitors. For no matter where she was moved to, or what angle she stood at, she never took her eyes off them for a second. My friend told me that, as long as he lives, the thought of how she watched them will always give him chills. Whenever I used to hear of someone living in a haunted house, I always thought the house had to be at least 100 years old and very ran down. I know better than that now. Back in the 70s, my husband and I moved into a nice little house in a small town in Tennessee. For about the first 6 months, it was our dream house. But then strange things started to happen. When we were in the kitchen, the TV in the living room would change channels. Sometimes the knobs would fly off the TV and land in the floor on the other side of the room. If we were in the living room, we would sometimes hear the kitchen cabinets open and close. Every time we were in the bathroom and sat down on the toilet, the light would go out, stand up, and the light would come back on. That was the only comical thing about that house. Things started to disappear around the house. At first, we thought that some of the neighborhood kids were breaking into our house when we were gone. My husband nailed the windows shut from the inside. That seemed to solve our problem for a little while. About 3 weeks later, we took the kids and spent the day with their grandmother. When we returned later that day, what we saw was really horrible. Everything we owned, food, clothing, furniture, toys, everything, was in a pile in our living room floor. Our windows were still nailed shut from the inside, and all of our doors were locked. That night my husband woke me, sometime after midnight, standing at the foot of our bed, was what looked to be a little old woman in a white nightgown. She vanished a second or two later. The next day we did some research on the house, and we discovered that the last owner had died in the room where we slept. We put the house back on the market a short time later and moved to another town. 1 week later, our dream house burned to the ground due to faulty wiring. I will always believe that she ran us away to save our lives, and for that I thank her. When my father was young, around 9 years old, he lived in Gary, Indiana, where, reportedly, the lady in white was seen. He and his friends decided to go to see the apparition for themselves one night. That very same day, my grandmother had bought my father a brand new pair of shoes. This is important. Apparently, the ghost was usually seen on the banks of a stream in the area, and many people had also decided to go see the ghost that same night. From what I understand, it turned into sort of an impromptu camping party, with people sharing stories and food and tents. My grandfather's shoes were very stiff and uncomfortable, so he took them off, left them by his tent, and went to his friend's car to get some potatoes and aluminum foil to bake some potatoes for dinner. Suddenly, someone shouted, "There she is!" My father was so scared, even though he really hadn't even seen her yet, that he ran all the way back home, leaving his shoes there. The next day, his mother asked where his new shoes were, and he told her what happened. He got in trouble for leaving his shoes by the creek, but he didn't get in trouble for going out looking for ghosts. I was in El Paso, Texas, at the age of 5 when this happened. It was just about dusk, and my sister and I were playing outside. We were jumping on an old set of box springs when something in my head told me to stop and look. I stopped jumping and turned and looked towards an adobe fence that was to my right, just in time to see a figure of a tall, slender woman emerge from it. She wore a long white veil and a long white tattered dress. It swayed slowly, and she glided about a foot off the ground. She walked straight across the yard, which was about 70 feet wide, and then she just disappeared as she entered the fence on the left side of the yard. My sister, who had stopped to see what I was looking at, watched the whole thing, and when it disappeared, she cried out, "Ah! Ghost!" I didn't really know what a ghost was at the time, but I ran behind her into the house because she sounded so scared. I was never afraid when it happened. I didn't know what it was. I just didn't think anything of it. I just looked. We told our uncle and then our mother, and they went to check, but found nothing. My sister denies to this day that this happened, but I have a memory like an elephant. I don't know why I saw this, but I feel that it changed my way of thinking somehow. I was a child, but I have always remembered this.